People like you have no right to question the police. Julian Carter was slammed against a car by corrupt police officer. Grant Harlan handcuffed so tightly that his wrists bled and thrown into a holding cell on a string of fabricated charges. Harlan thought he had just arrested a suspicious man snooping around an affluent neighborhood, never realizing that the man in the hoodie was the mayor of Westbridge. Julian only had to reveal his identity to be released, but he chose to remain silent and let Harlan expose his true nature on camera. What will happen when the entire police station realizes whom they are holding, and why will Harlan lose his badge before the 60th minute? The steel handcuffs snapped shut with a cold click, biting deep into the wrists of Julian Carter, the newly inaugurated mayor of Westbridge. Grant Harlan, a veteran police officer known for his hardline approach in the Crestwood neighborhood, tightened them another notch and shoved Julian's face down against the roof of the old sedan. Harlan smiled triumphantly, convinced that he had just caught someone scouting wealthy homes in preparation for a burglary. He had no idea that the man in the hoodie under his control was the city's highest-ranking official, and in less than an hour, those very hands would be forced to remove the badge from his chest. About 30 minutes earlier, Julian had quietly left City Hall through the employee elevator. After a day filled with meetings and polite smiles, he wanted to see Westbridge without a motorcade or carefully edited reports. He left his charcoal suit in the office and changed into a silver-gray hoodie, dark jeans, and a baseball cap pulled low over his forehead. In the basement, Julian walked past the official SUV and opened the door of a faded blue sedan. The car had once belonged to his father, a mechanic who had spent 30 years repairing city buses and died before the day his son was elected. Julian's destination was Crestwood, Westbridge's wealthiest residential neighborhood. 3 families had submitted letters warning about a sinkhole expanding near Franklin Elementary School, but the Department of Public Works had repeatedly marked the matter as non-urgent. A photograph sent to the mayor's office that afternoon showed cracks in the edge of the road, extending dangerously close to the student crosswalk. Julian did not want to wait for another report. He drove slowly along Hawthorne Street, examining the pavement beneath the misting rain and searching for construction signs that should have been installed days earlier. On the passenger seat lay the complaint files, a map of the drainage system, and a flashlight. 2 blocks away, Grant Harlan was sitting behind the wheel of Patrol Car 27. Beside him sat Noah Bennett, a 24-year-old rookie officer who had graduated from the academy less than 3 months earlier. Harlan was in a foul mood. That morning, he had received notice that he had been denied promotion to sergeant for the 4th time. Instead of examining the complaints of excessive force in his record, he blamed Julian Carter's new administration. According to Harlan, City Hall was empowering people who liked to complain and tying the hands of police officers who actually knew how to control the streets. He did not recognize the mayor's face without the suit and campaign poster. When Julian's old sedan appeared beneath the streetlights, Harlan immediately sat up straight. He watched the car move slowly past iron fences and garages, large enough to hold 4 vehicles, then constructed an entire story in his mind. "He's casing houses," Harlan said, his voice dripping with contempt. Noah leaned forward and looked through the windshield. All he saw was a driver examining the road. At his superior's request, Noah entered the license plate into the computer. The results were clear. The vehicle was legally registered, had no outstanding warrants, had not been reported stolen, and was registered to the Carter Family Foundation. "We don't have grounds to stop him," Noah cautiously pointed out. "A family foundation," Harlan curled his lip. "Sounds more like a money laundering front." Noah was about to say that suspicion could not replace evidence, but the cold stare from his training officer made him stop. Harlan tightened his grip on the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. "I've spent 15 years on these streets, rookie. My experience is the grounds." He flipped the switch. Red and blue lights immediately burst to life, sweeping across the wet pavement and silent rows of trees. The siren wailed behind the sedan. Julian saw the flashing lights in his rearview mirror, slowly reduced his speed, and pulled over. At that exact moment, he decided that tonight he would not tell them he was the mayor. Julian pulled the sedan close to the curb, turned off the engine, and lowered the window. He placed both hands on the steering wheel, keeping them where they could be seen clearly. Through the rearview mirror, he watched Harlan step out of the patrol car with a tactical flashlight in his hand, while Noah followed but stopped near the rear of the sedan. Harlan approached with the stride of a man who believed the entire street belonged to him. He leaned down toward the window and shone the bright white beam directly into Julian's eyes. Driver's license, registration, and proof of insurance. No greeting, no introduction, and no explanation. "Good evening, officer," Julian said calmly. "May I ask what traffic law I violated?" Harlan lowered the flashlight, slightly seemingly offended that the man in the old car had dared to question him. He claimed that Julian had been driving too slowly, obstructing traffic, and had touched the center line at the previous intersection. Julian knew that all three accusations were false. He had been driving 5 miles below the speed limit, there were no vehicles behind him, and he had never left his lane. Even so, Julian did not argue. My wallet is in my back pocket. The registration is in the glove compartment. I'll get my wallet first. Julian slowly removed one hand from the steering wheel. The moment he reached toward his pocket, Harlan immediately placed his hand on his gun and released the holster's retention lock. A sharp click sounded inside the car. Slowly, he warned. Noah took half a step forward. He's only retrieving the documents you asked for. Harlan glared at him, ordering him to remain silent. Julian took out his wallet, removed his driver's license, and handed it through the window. Harlan snatched it away and shone his flashlight on the name Julian Carter, but did not recognize it. In his mind, the mayor existed only in expensive suits on campaign posters. He could not possibly be the man in a hoodie sitting inside a faded sedan. The address on the license was still Julian's old home in the South Ward. Harlan looked at the address and curled his lip. You're pretty far from home. Looking for a garage someone forgot to lock. Julian's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained calm. He explained that he was inspecting the road surface in the sinkhole near Franklin Elementary School. Harlan laughed and asked when someone like him had become a city engineer. I work for Westbridge, Julian replied. Harlan glanced at the old car. Let me guess. You sweep the floors at City Hall. Julian looked at the nameplate on the officer's chest, G. Harlan. The name immediately matched that of the officer who had appeared in a series of complaint files Julian had been reviewing in private. Unlawful vehicle searches, allegations of excessive force, reports that always ended with the words, insufficient evidence. Julian could end everything by revealing who he was. But if he were merely an ordinary citizen from the South Ward, what would Harlan do next? Julian's calm silence only made Harlan angrier. He slammed his palm against the roof of the car, the sound exploding through the deserted street. Step out of the vehicle now, before I drag you out. Julian kept both hands on the steering wheel. Am I being detained or am I free to go? He asked. It was a simple legal question, but to Harlan, it sounded like an open challenge. He was not accustomed to explaining the limits of his authority to people he had already decided were suspicious. You're being detained, Harlan shouted. I have the right to order a driver out of the vehicle during a lawful traffic stop. Julian knew what Harlan was deliberately ignoring, that authority could only be exercised when the traffic stop itself had lawful grounds. But he also knew how quickly an argument on the side of the road could end with a gunshot. Julian had a family waiting for him to come home. He would not gamble with his life just to prove that he was right. I'm getting out, Julian said clearly. He unfastened his seatbelt, opened the door, and slowly placed his feet on the wet pavement. The moment Julian stood upright, Harlan grabbed the shoulder of his hoodie, violently spun him around, and slammed him against the car. A heavy thud sounded as Julian's chest struck the cold metal. Before he could regain his balance, Harlan's forearm pressed against the back of his neck, pinning his face to the rain-soaked roof. Spread your legs. Harlan kicked Julian's ankle, forcing him into a wider stance. Julian did not resist. I am complying with every command, he said through constricted breaths. There is no reason to use this level of force. Noah hurried forward, his unease clearly visible on his face. He hasn't done anything dangerous. He isn't resisting. Harlan did not look at the rookie. Search the car. Noah hesitated for a second, then shone his flashlight into the sedan. There was only a cup of cold coffee on the dashboard. The passenger seat held city planning documents, public works maps, and a collection of residents' complaints about the sinkhole near Franklin Elementary School. No weapons, no burglary tools, nothing that supported any theory of a planned break-in. The car is clean, Noah reported. Everything matches what he told us. We should let him go. That suggestion made Harlan press his forearm down even harder. Releasing Julian now would mean admitting in front of a rookie that he had been wrong from the beginning. His pride would not allow it. Harlan leaned close to Julian's ear. People like you always think that learning a few legal phrases gives you the right to question the police. Julian's anger turned cold instead of erupting. He turned his head just enough to see Harlan from the corner of his eye. What kind of people are people like me? Julian asked. Noah held his breath. Harlan froze, but only for a moment. The question had forced him to confront something he never wanted to say aloud. That's enough. Put your hands behind your back. Harlan seized Julian's left arm and twisted it up between his shoulder blades. Julian did not resist. "What am I being arrested for?" Harlan pulled Julian's other arm behind him. "Failure to obey a lawful command, resisting an officer, and suspected surveillance of private residences. We'll decide what else to charge you with when we get to the station." The steel handcuffs locked around Julian's wrists. Harlan deliberately tightened them another notch. The metal edges dug into his skin, sending sharp pains shooting along both arms. "You are making an irreversible mistake," Julian said quietly. Harlan laughed, pulled Julian away from the sedan, and shoved him toward the patrol car. "Save that for your public defender." He opened the rear door and forced Julian into the cramped compartment with its hard plastic seat. The door slammed shut, trapping him behind the thick partition. Julian looked through the window and saw that the patrol car's front-facing camera was still recording. Noah had witnessed everything. The documents in the sedan corroborated his statement. Every lie Harlan told from that point forward would only create more evidence against him. Julian could easily have revealed his identity before the car drove away, but he chose not to. The patrol car rolled out of Crestwood, leaving the old sedan beneath the streetlights. Julian sat upright, even as the handcuffs cut deeply into his wrists. Through the partition, he looked calmly at Harlan. The officer still believed he had won. Julian would let him hold on to that belief a little longer. He would let Harlan take him all the way to the station, enter the fabricated charges into the record, and dig a hole so deep that no union could pull him out. The patrol car descended the ramp leading into the secure intake area of Precinct 5. When the steel door lowered behind them, Harlan turned and looked at Julian through the partition. "End of the road, Carter. Welcome to my house." He pulled Julian out of the vehicle, deliberately gripping him by the wrists where the handcuffs had already scraped the skin, then led him inside. Rainwater still dripped from Julian's hoodie and pant legs. His hands were restrained behind his back, but he kept his spine straight. Harlan marched him through the crowded work area loudly, calling on his colleagues to look at the Crestwood burglar he had just arrested. At the intake desk, Sergeant Walter Quinn looked up from his computer screen. Harlan tossed Julian's driver's license into a metal tray and claimed that he had caught Julian casing Holmes, refusing to exit his vehicle and resisting arrest. Quinn turned to Noah. "Is that true?" Noah looked at Harlan, then at the red marks around Julian's wrists. "He asked a lot of questions and didn't want to get out of the car without knowing why," he answered cautiously. "But he didn't use force." The smile on Harlan's face stiffened. That single statement had created the first contradiction between the arresting officer's account and that of the only witness. "I was stopped without lawful grounds," Julian said. "There was no contraband, no criminal conduct, and no evidence that I was casing any home. I complied with every command. Officer Harlan used force first, then fabricated charges, after I asked why I was being detained." Quinn examined Julian more closely. The soaking wet man standing before him was not shouting, begging, or cursing. Julian laid out each fact with the cold precision of an attorney building a court record. Quinn recognized that something was wrong, but fatigue and habit prevailed. He merely sighed and ordered the intake process to continue. The handcuffs were briefly removed so Julian could surrender his cap, hoodie belt, and shoelaces. His phone and wallet were placed in a plastic tray. His mayor's office identification card remained inside a concealed compartment at the back of his wallet, and no one bothered to check it. Julian looked up at the black dome camera on the ceiling and noticed that the recording indicator was illuminated. Good. Every lie told at the intake desk already had an electronic witness. Harlan fastened the handcuffs again and shoved him into a holding cell that smelled of bleach, sweat, and stale urine. Two other men were lying on the concrete bench against the wall. "I have the right to make a phone call," Julian said through the bars. Harlan turned his back. "When I'm finished writing my report," Julian did not waste a second of the next 20 minutes. He memorized the time he had been brought in, the names of everyone present, the locations of the cameras, every statement Harlan had made, and every discrepancy in the report. At the same time, a plan to reform the patrol division began taking shape in his mind: mandatory body cameras, independent data storage, and the reopening of complaints that had previously been buried. Quinn eventually forced Harlan to allow him to make his call. Julian was escorted to the telephone mounted on the wall, but he did not call an attorney. He picked up the receiver and entered a secure number known only to the three most powerful people in Westbridge. Julian pressed the ice-cold receiver to his ear and entered 10 digits from memory. The number did not appear in any public directory. It had been established for situations that could threaten all of Westbridge, and only 3 people were authorized to use it. Nearly 6 miles from Precinct 5, a piercing ringtone sounded in the dark bedroom of Evelyn Ross, the city's police chief. She jolted awake, saw the security code on the screen, and immediately sat upright. A call at that hour could only signal an attack, a riot, or a disaster, placing hundreds of people in danger. Ross speaking. Her voice was still hoarse from sleep, but it immediately became alert. "Evelyn, it's me, Julian Carter." Ross stepped out of bed. "Mr. Mayor, what happened? Where are you?" Julian looked down the dirty hallway beneath the fluorescent lights. Harlan was sitting nearby with his head lowered as he wrote his report, occasionally exchanging words with a colleague. "I'm standing beside the telephone in the intake area of Precinct 5, Julian replied. "I have no shoes and no belt. My wrists have been scraped because the handcuffs were fastened too tightly. And at this moment, I am being held on entirely fabricated charges." Ross fell silent for several seconds. She looked at the clock beside her bed, trying to make her mind accept what she had just heard. "Are you conducting an unannounced inspection?" she asked, still clinging to the least horrifying explanation. "No," Julian replied. "I am being held as a suspect." He described how Harlan had stopped him without cause, invented traffic violations, and assumed that he was casing Holmes solely because of his old car and South Ward address. He described Harlan's discriminatory language, how the officer had slammed him against the car, pressed a forearm against the back of his neck, deliberately tightened the handcuffs until they injured him, and then fabricated charges of failure to comply and resisting an officer. Julian continued in an even voice, colder than anger. He told Ross that Noah had confirmed Julian had not used force, yet Harlan had written the opposite in his report. Every detail was presented in order from the time of the traffic stop to the locations of the cameras at the intake desk. Ross had hastily pulled on a robe, but both her hands had gone cold. A black mayor newly elected on a promise of police reform had just been subjected to discrimination, assaulted, and thrown into a holding cell by one of her officers using a falsified report. If the incident became public before the evidence was secured, it would not merely end Harlan's career. It could become a nationwide civil rights crisis and drag the entire police department down with him. "Sir, I am deeply sorry. I'll call Precinct 5 right now." Ross reached for a second phone, but Julian stopped her. "No, you must not warn them." Ross froze. Julian instructed her to come to the station, personally summon Captain Marcus Bell, and immediately preserve the footage from Patrol Car 27 and the intake area's security system. No one was to alter the report, disable any camera, or leave the shift before she arrived. "I want you and Bell to see with your own eyes how this unit operates when they believe the person locked in the holding cell has no power," Julian said. "If I had revealed my identity on the street, Harlan would only have learned that he chose the wrong victim. I want him to understand that no victim is ever the right choice." Ross swallowed hard. "I'll be there in 15 minutes. Julian replaced the receiver. Harlan looked up and sneered. "How did it go, Carter? Call your mother to come save you." Julian turned around, his calm gaze making Harlan's smile briefly stiffen. "No, Harlan. I just woke the person who has the authority to decide your future." A flicker of unease crossed the officer's face, but his arrogance quickly crushed it. He grabbed Julian by the arm, shoved him back into the holding cell, and locked the door. At that same moment, Ross sped her unmarked SUV through the rain-slicked streets, its emergency lights flashing behind the grill. She called Captain Marcus Bell, who was asleep on the sofa in his second-floor office at Precinct 5. When he heard the name of the man Harlan had just arrested, Bell sprang to his feet and rushed toward the stairs, while downstairs, Harlan still had absolutely no idea who the man behind the bars was. "Marcus, listen very carefully." Police Chief Evelyn Ross's voice came through the phone with an urgency Captain Marcus Bell had never heard in more than 20 years of working with her. "Go down to intake. Check the detention log, protect the person who was just brought in, and do not let anyone touch the record. Do not raise the alarm or ask questions in front of the entire shift." "I'm on my way." The call ended before Bell could ask what had happened. He stared at the screen for a second. Ross had commanded officers during riots without the slightest tremor in her voice. Tonight, she was afraid. Bell hurriedly pulled on his uniform shirt and rushed down the metal staircase. When he pushed open the door and entered the work area, the sounds of telephones, keyboards, and conversations immediately stopped. The captain rarely appeared downstairs after midnight unless there was a crisis. Harlan sprang to his feet beside his desk, while Noah quickly clasped his trembling hands together. Bell looked at no one. He went directly to the intake desk and held out his hand to Sergeant Quinn. "Give me the record for the person who was just brought in." Quinn immediately printed the file and placed the still warm sheet of paper in his hand. Bell read the first line. "Arrestee Julian Carter. Arresting Officer Grant Harlan." The charges included failure to obey a lawful command, resisting an officer, and suspected surveillance of private residences. None of the charges were supported by physical evidence or any specific criminal act. Bell stopped breathing. He read the name again more slowly than the first time, as though the letters might rearrange themselves into someone else. Then he asked for the property bag. Quinn pushed the plastic tray forward. Bell opened the wallet, checked the concealed compartment at the back, and removed an identification card bearing the city seal. The photograph, full name and words, Mayor of Westbridge, were clearly visible beneath the lights. Harlan. Bell's voice was so low that the entire room became even quieter. "Where is the man you just brought in?" Harlan pointed toward the hallway. "Holding cell 3. That guy casing houses. Shut your mouth." Bell's shout made Harlan flinch. "Do not say another word. Do not touch the report, the computer, or any equipment." Bell tightened his grip on the identification card and nearly ran toward the holding cells. Through the bars, he saw Julian sitting on a concrete bench, wearing only a thin shirt, his shoeless feet resting on the dirty floor, and both wrists marked by red bleeding rings. Bell unlocked the door with hands that had lost their usual steadiness. "Sir, I am deeply sorry. Please come out. I'll take you upstairs to my office, call medical personnel, and return all your belongings immediately." Julian did not stand. "Leave the door open, Marcus. But I will remain here until Chief Ross arrives." Bell was about to object, but Julian's gaze caught the words in his throat. "I want her to see exactly where a citizen is held when her subordinates believe no one cares about him." Bell could only step back and stand at attention outside the open door, like a guard protecting his own prisoner. The strange sight quickly spread unease throughout the work area. Noah remembered standing by as Harlan slammed Julian against the car and tightened the handcuffs another notch. He had known it was wrong, yet he had still followed orders. Harlan watched Bell standing at attention outside the holding cell, then glanced down at the report. Julian Carter. His heart began to race. No, he told himself. It was only a coincidence. The mayor did not drive an old car, wear a hoodie, or live in the South Ward. At that moment, emergency lights swept across the windows. The security door opened. Evelyn Ross walked in, headed straight toward the holding cell, and spoke loudly enough for the entire precinct to hear "Mr. Mayor." The words "Mr. Mayor" surged through the work area like an electric current. The telephones continued ringing, but no one answered them. Fingers resting on keyboards stopped moving. The pen in Harlan's hand slipped free and struck the tile floor with a sharp click. He looked at Julian through the wide-open holding cell door and finally understood the full truth. The man he had discriminated against, mocked, slammed against a car, handcuffed, and locked behind bars was the leader of Westbridge. In a single instant, Harlan's 15 years of arrogance collapsed into naked terror. Noah had to grip the edge of the desk to steady himself. His mind replayed every opportunity he had missed: when Harlan initiated the stop without cause, when he released the retention lock on his holster, and when he shoved Julian into the patrol car. Noah had spoken up, but never forcefully enough to stop what was happening. Now he was not merely a witness to an unlawful arrest. He was also a passive accomplice who had allowed his superior to turn prejudice into a criminal record. A few steps away, Ross removed her cap, while Bell stood at attention outside the door. Both repeatedly apologized and offered to call medical personnel, but Julian remained seated on the concrete bench. "Not yet," he said. "Before you return my shoes or coat, let everyone take a good look." Julian raised his wrists, marked with red rings. "This is what happens when power goes unchecked. If I had walked in here wearing a suit with a security detail beside me, this would not have happened. But the people of Westbridge cannot carry official titles to protect themselves." After several seconds of heavy silence, he stood and walked out. His sock-covered feet touched the dirty tile floor softly. Wearing only a thin shirt with no belt or shoes, Julian still crossed the work area with an authority that made the armed officers instinctively move aside. He stopped in front of Harlan. "You asked what I did for the city," Julian said. "Then you guessed that I only swept the floors at City Hall." Harlan's lips trembled. "Sir, I didn't know. If I had realized you were the mayor, I never would have." "That is precisely the problem." Julian cut him off, his voice, quiet but powerful enough to silence Harlan immediately. "You did not know I was the mayor, so you assumed I did not matter. You saw an old car, a hoodie, and a South Ward address, and decided that I had no right to question you. If I had been an ordinary citizen, the lies in that report could have cost me my job, the money to hire an attorney, and even my freedom." Julian turned to face the entire shift. "For the past 3 weeks, I have been quietly reviewing the police department's internal affairs files. Grant Harlan's name is at the top of the list of officers who pose a risk to the community." Harlan's face turned deathly pale. Julian listed the complaints of violence, unlawful vehicle searches, and discrimination that had repeatedly been closed. Every time Harlan was about to be held accountable, the union applied pressure, witnesses were discredited, or the cameras conveniently failed to work. "I did not stage tonight's arrest," Julian said. "I went to Crestwood to inspect the sinkhole. But I knew you patrolled that area. I wanted to see for myself whether the man described in those files was real." "You set me up," Harlan said, swallowing hard. Julian looked directly at him. "I drove at the proper speed, presented my documents, and obeyed your commands. If that was all it took for you to destroy yourself, then the only trap here was your own character." He reiterated that Harlan had been given opportunity after opportunity to stop. Noah warned that there were no grounds for the traffic stop. The license plate came back completely clean. The car contained no weapons or contraband. Julian never resisted. Yet Harlan still chose to fabricate charges, use force, and tighten the handcuffs merely to punish a man who dared to ask questions. He had not only confirmed what the records described, he had exceeded everything Julian had feared. Ross stepped forward and announced that the technical unit had preserved the evidence. The patrol car camera had recorded the entire traffic stop. The security system at the intake desk had captured every false statement clearly. Noah could confirm that Julian had never resisted. There was no longer any room for Harlan to alter his story. Julian looked at the officer who had prowled the streets like a predator. "You are a danger to the public," he said. "And you are the reason people no longer trust that those who wear a badge will protect them." Then Julian turned to Police Chief Ross. "Strip him of his weapon, his police authority, and his badge right now." Julian's order was still echoing through the room when Captain Marcus Bell stepped forward. There was no trace of panic left on his face, only the cold fury of a man who had finally been given permission to deal with a threat the system had protected for far too long. "Harlan, move both hands away from your belt," Bell ordered. Harlan instinctively started to reach for his holster, but the look in Bell's eyes made him immediately spread his hands. Every officer on the shift stood motionless. No one looked at a screen, no one pretended to work. The man who had once walked the streets of Crestwood as though his badge gave him ownership of the city was now being stripped of his power in front of the very colleagues who had once feared him. "Radio first." Bell held out his hand. Harlan removed the device from his shoulder and placed it in Bell's palm. His service weapon came next. Bell personally released the holster lock, removed the firearm, checked the chamber, and handed it to an internal affairs officer who had just entered. Harlan took his department identification card from his wallet, removed the patrol car keys from his belt, and placed each item on the desk. Every metallic sound against the tabletop felt like a period at the end of a sentence. Finally, Bell pointed to the badge on Harlan's chest. Harlan's fingers trembled so badly that it took him 2 attempts to release the clasp. As the badge came away from his uniform, the digital clock on the wall had just reached the 58th minute since he had handcuffed Julian. Bell took the badge without a word and placed it beside the gun. Police Chief Ross announced that Harlan was immediately suspended, stripped of all police authority, and placed in the custody of Internal Affairs. 2 investigators stepped forward and stood on either side of him. The conduct requiring investigation was read aloud before the entire shift: unlawful arrest, falsification of a police report, excessive use of force, violation of civil rights, and deliberate obstruction of an investigation through false information. Harlan looked around as though waiting for a colleague to defend him, but no one moved. The union could hire an attorney for him. It could not erase the camera footage, alter Noah's statement, or make the injuries on the mayor's wrists disappear. "Sir, please listen to me," Harlan said, his voice turning hoarse. "I made a mistake because I didn't know who you were." Julian stepped closer to the desk where the badge lay. "You still don't understand." He looked at Harlan, but spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. "You are not losing your badge because you mistakenly arrested the mayor. You are losing it because you deliberately abused a cooperative citizen. You lied about the reason for the traffic stop, used force to punish someone for asking questions, and then fabricated charges to protect your pride. My identity does not make your conduct more serious. It only caused your conduct to be discovered more quickly." Julian turned toward Noah. The young officer immediately stood straighter, his face deathly pale. "You knew there were no grounds for the traffic stop," Julian said. "You reminded Harlan that the license plate came back clean. You confirmed that I did not use force and recommended releasing me." A flicker of hope appeared in Noah's eyes, then vanished as Julian continued. "But when he slammed me against the car, you stood by and watched. When he tightened the handcuffs and fabricated charges, you still followed him. Good intentions cannot protect the public if courage exists only in your thoughts. Remaining silent in the face of misconduct is also a form of complicity. Noah lowered his head. I understand, sir. I will tell the whole truth. Julian did not strip Noah of his badge. He required the rookie officer to testify truthfully, remain under supervision throughout his probationary period, and complete a professional ethics program before being allowed to patrol independently. This is your only opportunity, Julian warned. If you ever stand by again while a citizen is subjected to an abuse of power because you are afraid of a fellow officer, you will lose your badge as quickly as Harlan did tonight. Noah nodded, his eyes reddening with shame. Julian then looked toward Sergeant Quinn. Harlan's suspension did not end the responsibility of everyone else. Quinn had seen the contradictions and recognized that Julian did not match the description in the report, yet he had still chosen to complete the intake process instead of asking questions. The entire intake operation at Precinct 5 would be investigated. Quinn silently brought over the property tray. Julian laced his shoes, fastened his belt, and put on his still damp hoodie. He slipped his wallet into his pocket, checked his phone, and pulled the old baseball cap low over his forehead. Within minutes, every visible sign of his office had disappeared again. He looked exactly like the man Harlan had seen on Hawthorne Street, an ordinary citizen driving an old car. Ross offered to take him to the hospital and personally drive him home afterward. Julian declined. He had texted his wife to pick him up and would have his family doctor examine his wrists. The next priority was not escorting the mayor, but preserving the evidence before anyone could interfere with it. Evelyn Marcus, 8 o'clock tomorrow morning at City Hall, Julian said. Bring the department's complete budget, all union agreements, disciplinary records from the past 5 years, and a list of every complaint ever dismissed for insufficient evidence. Ross nodded. Julian demanded a new policy requiring body cameras to activate automatically during every traffic stop. The data had to be stored on an independent system that patrol officers and precinct commanders could not alter. Every complaint involving Harlan would be reopened. A civilian oversight board with the authority to access records and recommend accountability measures would be established instead of allowing the police department to investigate itself. Julian was not finished. Officers who reported misconduct by their colleagues had to be protected from retaliation, demotion, or reassignment. Funding for armored vehicles and unnecessary military equipment would be redirected toward cameras, de-escalation training, and professional accountability programs. Ross committed every demand to memory. She understood that the meeting the following morning would not be a symbolic discussion. Julian had entered the system as an anonymous citizen and witnessed firsthand how it protected abusers at every level. The hesitant rookie, the sergeant who followed routine commanders who knew nothing, in a union that buried complaints. Stripping away one badge could not repair all that corruption. The two internal affairs investigators escorted Harlan away from his desk. Without his weapon, radio, or badge, he was merely a man wearing a uniform that had lost all meaning. He watched Julian walk past, but did not dare say another word. Julian felt no joy, only the cold satisfaction of knowing that a threat had been removed from the streets. Outside, a familiar car waited in the rain. The clock in the intake area reached the 59th minute, since the handcuffs had snapped shut. Julian pulled his cap low and walked out of Precinct 5 carrying 2 red rings on his wrists that the entire city would soon be forced to see. His wife opened the car door, but Julian stopped before getting in. He turned to look at the cold concrete building and the stark white windows glowing behind the curtain of rain. Ross stood beneath the awning, waiting for his final instruction. Julian looked at her, his voice calm but as sharp as a declaration of war. Tonight we removed only one badge. Tomorrow morning, we will tear apart the entire system that protected it.